Good morning. It's Monday, and I was taking some time this weekend while mowing the lawn to re-listen to the storyline of Esther, and I came across this idea that I've noted in the paragraph in this article. What if Esther and understanding Esther and its characters can really be discovered in the contrast between those characters and in connection to that contrast, the characters' connections to things in wisdom literature. And this began to raise a series of things sort of off the pages of the text. So, for example, I'm just going to dialogue briefly about some of these in this as an introduction, and then perhaps as I spend more time fully diving into all of this, I'll tease this out in a couple other places, or maybe this will suffice, and we'll see. So the first of them came about as I looked at the characters of Vashti and Esther, the two contrasting queens in the storyline. And here's what I noticed. So Esther is depicted as sort of ingratiating herself to everybody she encounters, but especially to Ahasuerus. We see that in the banquet narratives. So in the banquet narratives, she's consistently, sort of, if it pleases the king, if it's this, if, O king, in your good graces, you decide X, Y, Z. So she's approaching her conversation with her husband and the king in a manner that's humble, that's full of tact, and that is wise in the sense that instead of coming outright and being bold and confrontational and sort of effrontery to what is happening in the narrative, she approaches this with an eye on the king's sensitivities. And as she unpacks those sensitivities and brings to the king at the right time, in the right way, and in the right moment, the reality dawns and things become clear. And that is I think, a bit of a depiction of the wise characters of our books like Proverbs. The timing of the request and the way you approach a king and how you conduct yourself in presence and the way that you seek counsel, and then the way that you go about deploying that with tact and with not necessarily an eye on just sort of placating, but knowing the situation that you're in and playing to the audience that you have in front of you as a way to demonstrate and bring forward the truth that doesn't hinder it when it needs to be heard. Esther presents that kind of gracious and gentle and yet assertive presence when she's with Ahasuerus. And she brings forward this sort of characteristic feminine depiction of Lady Wisdom as a character who holds out good things, but who holds them out to us by inviting us into something. And Esther seems to be doing the same thing. She's inviting Ahasuerus into a situation, into a thing, by playing on, and I think she's doing this intentionally, not just to say this is sort of a play. I think this is part of the character of Esther. But her character is developing if I play by the customs and the mores, if I come humbly before the king and I act in ways that honor the king and yet assert what is right, then the request will be honored. And that seems to be what's transpiring. And ironically, as the story develops, her inviting the king into her situation involves inviting the king to a banquet. The king in the text of Esther doesn't make decisions of his own. He makes decisions based on the counsel he receives, which is another big theming piece from the text of Proverbs. The counsel we receive as it shapes our decisions demonstrates wisdom or lack thereof. And I think this is part of the thing that is unfolding and transpiring in the storyline. And so Esther represents, in a sense, in this wisdom literature tradition. And I had to go and look. I was like, this can't be a new idea. Somebody has to have developed this in the past. And I ran across a handful of sources that started to tease some of these things out. But Esther sort of represents this Lady Wisdom, the noble and virtuous wife, who is an industrious individual, who is a beautiful individual, not just in a physical sense, but in a character sense, in a personhood sense. And Esther demonstrates that as we see this. Not only is she physically beautiful, we're told that early in the story, but she's the beautiful wife. She's the noble wife. She's the wise woman who provides the right counsel and the right turning of direction and the appropriate approach to a husband who inclines himself to the wisdom and the counsel of others in his court, and who inclines himself to making decisions based on the counsel that he receives. And so she doesn't approach him with a counsel that demands his attention and is sort of barking and hollering at him to do and change certain things, something that would look probably a bit more like the contentious or quarrelsome wife we hear about that creates strife and discord in some of the Proverbs. On the other hand, Vashti is presented us in the storyline as somebody who has a set of cares and concerns that are all her own and doesn't seem to possess the same kind of gracious humility that we see in the character of Esther. And I think the storyline is characterizing Vashti in this short snippet as refusing and being adamantly opposed to what the king has instructed, simply because of that play on this wisdom tradition. And so on top of that, what we're seeing is a play on the stereotype. And so we have a queen who is assertive and who refuses the request of not only her husband, but of the king. And this creates a bit of tension, where Esther gets what she's desiring by playing into and playing through the mores of the day, with wisdom, with tact, soaked in prayer and in fasting. And therein lies this connection. While God's not mentioned in the storyline, Proverbs has this repeated refrain that the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of the Holy One is this understanding, this wisdom. It's the core of everything that revolves around it. We want to talk about being wise and living a wise life. And Esther possesses all of the outward-facing character traits that demonstrates that she has the inward-facing fear of the Lord and knowledge of God that reorient the whole way that she looks at and sees the world around her. And that becomes this characteristic depiction of Esther. She is the noble, wise, and virtuous woman from the text of Proverbs. And from the text of Song of Songs, she's the woman who pursues her husband. Song of Songs can be read in a wisdom tradition sense as the noble and virtuous wife who pursues the husband, as wisdom, who is this divine entity, because wisdom only exists as part of the character of God, who's in pursuit of God's people. And Esther is in pursuit of righteousness and of justice and of her husband, right? She goes to him. She approaches him. She brings him to a banquet. But it's in her approach that wisdom is demonstrated. It's with this graciousness. It's with this humility. It's with this assertiveness that isn't outward facing, in the same kind of boldness and sort of staunchness that we see with Vashti. It has a grace and it has a beauty, it has an elegance, it has a humility to it that is very characteristic of the depictions of Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, who invites graciously to banquets with rich and lavish foods, who makes kings what they are and makes them righteous and establishes their throne in a way that brings relief and glory, not only to the king, but to the people who the king is responsible for. And so I think there's a contrast there in this idea of Lady Folly and Lady Wisdom in Vashti and in Esther. I think there's another layer of contrast, and it revolves around this idea of the counsel received by the king. Esther and Mordecai represent this wise and this noble and this righteous and just advice, even though we only see it in a few very small snippets, whereas Haman represents the impact of the disastrous advice of the wicked. we see him revealed, right, in the only sort of bold moment that Esther has in the text, as she decries him as an enemy. But his character and the lack of wisdom and the hostility and the unrighteousness and the injustice present in Haman's character is clear to us as the text unfolds, because of just the nature of his advice, but also because of the results and the consequences that advice has on the people. Haman's decree, signed in the name of the king and stamped with the signet, it throws the people into chaos and confusion. It brings about grand injustice that's going to need to be righted. The king has listened to the council, and his people are responding, sitting in sackcloth and ashes outside of the king's gate, for example. And this brings me to Mordecai then. Mordecai is rooted. The one consistent and rather fixed position that Mordecai takes is outside the king's gate. Dude is stationed and he will not be moved. Not even to bow in reverence to Haman. I think this is this really critical piece that's sort of reflecting on the early Psalms that talk about the righteous as planted next to the stream of life, and they will not be moved. They won't be shaken. There's this idea too in wisdom literature. But Mordecai is the righteous and the just, who is, while bothered and while troubled by the circumstance that has unfolded before him, he's not moved by it. And the way we see this, like physically, by his presence, he's outside the king's gate. This is where he is. This is where he can be found. And he's not moved until righteousness and justice are established, until his wise counsel is sought out. And then when he provides counsel, the whole situation changes. When he provides counsel to Esther about going before the king, the situation begins to change. And she's prepared and emboldened. And with his counsel, here's that wise counsel, right? He's the voice of wise counsel in the story. With his wise counsel, the queen now can go and approach the king to establish righteousness and justice. When his counsel is heeded by Ahasuerus, and that the second decree is written for the Jews to be able to defend themselves, and there is deliverance, right? And there is rejoicing, and there is a saving from the wicked. These are key themes in the text of Proverbs. And so what we see, I think, unfolding before us is a narrative that is grounded in a historic circumstance. I still do think it's got some historic validity, but I think it's intentionally trying to cross these lines of historically valid into this wisdom tradition, which I think is in large part why perhaps the names are altered. We're not necessarily looking at Xerxes as a historic figure, even though we might know that that's the king of Esther's queenship. But what we're looking at is a king who heeds the counsel of those around him. And when the counsel is evil and wicked and foolish, then sorry, I lost my train of thought. Who heeds the counsel around him, and when he heeds the counsel of the wicked, things go in the trajectory that Proverbs tells us. And when he heeds the counsel of the righteous, things go in the trajectory that Proverbs tells us. And so Esther seems to be a narrative look at the way Proverbs plays itself out with the noble and the virtuous woman, and wise versus unwise, or righteous and just versus unrighteous and unjust advice and character. And in this way, what we see happening in Esther is sort of a historic reframing of what wisdom has presented us as a way to see it in action and in the storyline of the text. I thought that was just a fascinating retake and worth a bit of an investigation. So I hope this was useful for you. Happy Monday, and have a good week. We'll talk soon.